Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 21st, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the Colorado Senate race, a race that many Democrats and Republicans really haven't been worrying about or really thinking about, largely because this race is viewed as unwinnable for the GOP. But taking a look at some of the data that has been released in the state of Colorado, yes, there are very good numbers here for the Democratic Party, but we have yet to see pretty consistent data out of the state, and the most recent one shows the Democrats ahead by a margin of just 8 points. Now, for a race that is so underfunded and understudied and under discussed, it is very interesting to see that the race might be as close as potentially another race that might be viewed as equally, in fact, more competitive, such as the state of New Hampshire, which potentially could be in an upwards of a 6 to 7 point margin of victory for the Democratic Party, despite it being expected at least to be one of the most closely competitive states. Now, the reason why I raised this question about whether or not it is a sleeper state and one that we really aren't paying attention to is because more recently there have been race rating changes in the state of Colorado. More specifically, the Cook Political Report has moved the state of Colorado from likely Democrat down to lean Democrat. Now, moving it from likely to lean is not necessarily this super significant shift that should be largely viewed or in any way viewed as, the Democratic Party weakening its grip on some of these states, but rather I would say maybe more so the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is picking up the pace in some of these other states that weren't really competitive before. Now, Michael Bennett is a candidate who ran in 2016 and won his race. If you take a look at the election history, we can just look and see it was a margin of about 5.6%, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. 5.7% Michael Bennett won by. Now, this margin wasn't exactly something that many people had expected. If you take a look at the 2016 forecast, the deluxe model, Polls Plus actually, you find that Colorado gave Michael Bennett about a 95% chance of victory, expecting him to win by a margin of about 8.3% statewide. So winning by 6 points was a bit of an underperformance from what he was expected to, but honestly it wasn't too far off. But generally you saw about a few point drop off in some of these Senate forecasts versus the actual results. Now, believe it or not, the forecast for this election cycle is a lot more confident in Michael Bennett's margin of victory. It's not in terms of its chances. If you look at the chances in 2016, it was 95%. Today, that is only 90%, despite the margin expected to be about 10, 11 points statewide. Now, that's super significant to a point where, I would say 10, 11 points shows that this is a 99% chance of victory. I mean, that is a double-digit victory, and yet it is only 90%. So I'm interested to see what really changed between the distinction and what changed between the percentage and chances of victory between 2016's forecast, 2020's forecast, 2022's forecast. But it is all around very, very interesting. Now, the state of Colorado at this point is definitely one where the Democratic Party at default should be winning. And if they're not, something is seriously wrong with the Democratic Party's messaging and strategy nationwide. But that's not what's happening. The Democratic Party is very much the base level, level of victory within the state of Colorado. Right now, they are very much expected to win. But the question is, does the GOP still have a chance? And maybe it could be very narrow. And another thing that really led me into this questioning about the state of Colorado is because we have seen sleeper states in the past, ones that typically don't get talked about that much, that end up being more competitive than ones that were maybe hyper-focused in that election. If you remember the 2020 Senate elections, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party funneled a lot of money, millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars into some of these races that ended up being less competitive than some of the races that received little to no funding at all. For instance, the state of Kansas had over $100 million poured into that Senate race. The Republican ended up winning by double digits. The state of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, Jamie Harrison, if you remember this race had $100 million funneled into it. Lindsey Graham won by 10 points. The state of Kentucky, Amy McGrath, Mitch McConnell in their race. Amy McGrath raised hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least the Democratic Party combined for that race, and lost by over 15 points. These states were the ones that were hyper-fixated by both parties in this election, and yet they ended up being not even that competitive. Versus some other states, such as the state of Michigan, that narrowed down to about a 1.7% margin of victory, less than what President Biden's was. The state of Minnesota, Tina Smith, a former lieutenant governor of the state, won her election in 2016, only won by 5.5%. Yes, 5.5% in a state that Biden won by over 7%. Again, a reduction in support between the presidential level and the Senate level. The state of New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan won this open race by a margin of about 6 points statewide. New Mexico went to Biden by double digits. Again, a significant drop-off to a point where the Democrats saw a severe underperformance in the state. But the thing is, Minnesota, Michigan, New Mexico, they were practically treated as safe and solid states and not really talked about much. Versus some other states, again, Kansas, South Carolina, and Kentucky ended up being less competitive, but with much more funding into the race. When you take a look at the 2020 Senate forecast in the state of Minnesota, for instance, Tina Smith was expected to win by 12 points. She won by 5. The state of Michigan, Gary Peters was expected to win by 7 points. He won by 2. New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan was expected to win by 13 points. He won by 6. But you take a look at those states that we focused a lot of time and effort on. Kansas, Roger Marshall was expected to win by 6. South Carolina, he did, by 12. South Carolina was expected to be a margin of 5 points. It was 10 points. Kentucky, we practically knew wasn't going to be competitive. Mitch McConnell was set to win by 13. He won by about 19. So it was a little bit off, but also it is still a pretty solid expectation, and a 96% chance of victory isn't something that I'd say, was wrong for 538 to predict. But to give the Democrat about a 1 in 5 chance in Kansas was quite surprising. I think that a lot of us, were really misled in the polling, industry, in the analytical industry, those in journalism, etc., etc. I think anyone who really paid close attention to these Senate races was misled. And I think they were misled largely because of the fact that the data in some of these states was just wrong. And the expectations from both parties were also very wrong as well. To treat Colorado, to treat New Mexico, to treat Michigan, to treat Minnesota as these safe states, maybe they aren't. But the state of Colorado last election cycle, John Hickenlooper was expected to beat Cory Gardner by a margin of about 8 points. In the 2020 election, he won by about 9. So depending on what you look at, and specifically the state we are talking about, 538 actually underestimated the Democratic Party, but practically got it spot on. So maybe they're doing that this election cycle. But I will say that it was very shocking to see that Michigan had to be counted for days rather than called at a very early time in the evening, or that New Mexico or Minnesota ended up being more competitive than states that we spent such a long time talking about. Now, I think that this map for the Senate race for 2022 is a lot different than the one that we saw in 2020. You don't really see Democrats vying for seats in this election cycle in states such as Kansas or South Carolina or Kentucky. Looking at the chances of victory here, you have overwhelming ones for the respective political parties that already hold them. But looking at some of the other states, I will say that I don't think we're in for this, wide difference between the prediction and the actual results, because we're working with similar territory. We're working with consistent swing states such as Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, etc. These are states that are always competitive. So realistically speaking, they're going to be close, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they are vying for states that are very winnable for both parties in this election cycle versus 2020, where maybe we were entirely misled by the forecast, by the polls, etc., just because there was a much better expectation for Democrats on this map than what the actual result was. But some states were accurate, even the one we're talking about today, Colorado, was very, very accurate. But still, you don't see the Democratic Party funneling tens of millions, potentially upwards of $100 million into Senate races that they know aren't winnable. Yes, the Democratic Party is raising money in some states that seem unwinnable, such as Ohio, but it's definitely not their main focus, and it's definitely not getting, political prominence over Georgia or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, right? So, for the sake of Colorado, I will say that I do think it will be closer than what 538 is currently saying. This is not to cast doubt on the model in any respect, but what it is to say is that I do think that the race will narrow up, and I do think that Joe O'Dea, as a pro-choice Republican, definitely jumps out of the Republican Party as a very different type of candidate. His level of messaging has never been about the Republican Party ever since winning the nomination, and I think that's something that many other Senate Republicans just simply cannot tap into. I've been saying this the entire election cycle, that 2022 is a very good year for the GOP, and that cannot be understated. This is such an easy year for them to win. It is the narrowest Senate majority possible, and yet they are struggling to win just one seat. You look at 2010, 2014, this would have been so easily done, and the fact that it isn't is quite surprising and quite disappointing looking at it from the perspective if you are a Republican. Colorado should be the question of whether or not it's competitive and should be receiving a lot more funding, because in a perfect reality for the GOP, or at least a mediocre one for the Senate map, taking advantage of their red wave, they would have already locked down, essentially speaking, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. But the fact that Democrats are putting up a good fight for it means that the Republican Party can't focus on states like Colorado. So the likely Democrat characterization is going to have to stay. It's 90% to 10%. It's a pretty significant chance here for the Democratic Party. But what I will say is, again, I do expect it to narrow up because I think that this individual race is different than many of the other ones that we have seen. Joe O'Dea is not like Herschel Walker. He's not like Blake Masters. He's not like practically any other Senate Republican. He has political views and political stances and overall a messaging that is so vastly different, and for many people in Colorado might be quite refreshing seeing what's happening on the national level. I think Bennett and O'Dea will end up in a race that is more competitive than expected, but I do not think that the Republicans will win it. It will take a lot to shift the nation in the direction of moving Colorado red, because Democrats now lead by about a point nationwide, and it's very different from where we were a month ago or 2 months ago or when the Colorado primary happened. The Republicans were up nationwide at that point, so back then it would have even been a better chance, but even then I wouldn't have said it is the likeliest outcome. The Republican Party has a lot of work to do, but as we saw in previous midterm years, they have been able to change public sentiment on Democrats and Republicans in about a week's time. There are a significant portion of the American public that is undecided at this point based off the generic ballot. Both Democrats and Republicans are hovering around 44-43%, which means you're talking about 15% of the electorate, more than that. That is undecided for the November election. You go back to 2020, you didn't really see this level of undecidedness. Democrats were at 50%, and that's about what they got. 2018, Democrats were about 51%, and that's what they got. Republicans won practically all of the undecided vote. This time, I don't think that's going to be true. I don't think Republicans are going to win all of the undecided vote, just simply because that would mean, a 15-point GOP generic ballot victory. That's not going to happen. Realistically, it just simply isn't going to happen. But looking at, 2022, based off the numbers that we have thus far, the GOP definitely has room to grow. It's not as if Democrats are at 50%, which was my point, not at the majority of the nation already, but rather voters are keeping them in mind, which is not what the GOP should have at this point. And honestly, it is, again, quite embarrassing that they haven't been able to do it thus far. But if they can change sentiment, Colorado could become more competitive. It's been pretty stagnant in terms of the expectations for the state. We haven't really seen many changes or shifts or expectation ratings besides the Cook Political Report and a couple of other firms that have slowly over the past couple of months moved Colorado to be more competitive. I think this might be really just a preemptive measure on the side of Cook Political Report to, really prepare for what they expect to be an assault on the state of Colorado. But I think that comes with a really big expectation on the GOP to make sure they still have money, they're allocating it correctly, and they're focusing their efforts in a very, very smart fashion. Because as of right now, I am not personally confident that the GOP is going to get to Colorado at their rate. Rick Scott is messing up with the NRSC. Mitch McConnell is spending his own money into races such as Ohio that never even should have been touched by the national GOP. Republicans started to spend ad buys in Colorado and Washington, then had to pull them out of more competitive states and thus have to reallocate funding away from those Washington and Colorado ad buys now to more swing states to raise money. What they are doing is essentially wasting this money, and they have nothing to show for it. Because on the overall Senate forecast, Democrats still remain with a 63% chance at remaining in control of the U.S. Senate with a 0-seat majority. It's fascinating to say the least, but it's something that the Republican Party, if they do in fact lose the Senate majority, cannot hold on or cannot win it. It will be something they need to reflect on and think about for the future, and think about new leadership for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, because what is happening right now with Rick Scott and Mitch McConnell on his own is really quite an embarrassment. I think there are ways for, Republicans to recover, to rebound, and a lot of it has to come from them. Democrats can mess up, but they have top-tier candidates. They have incumbents who have been tried and tested, a lot of them more recently too, surprisingly enough. And that's something that is very valuable. Recognizable names, liked names, electable names. Republicans, on the other hand, have people who are TV personalities. Yes, Donald Trump was one, but the state of Georgia is not the national level. Also, you have scandals, and yes, Donald Trump did as well, but guess what? Donald Trump was immune to a lot of things that would have taken down many other politicians. And all these Republicans, I wouldn't exactly say they are immune. There's a reason why they're on track to lose, and there's something to be said about candidates who have had scandals in the past two election cycles, 2018 and 2020, that have gone down very easily for simply those scandals. Whether that be a Republican primary, a Democratic primary, a general election, scandals do matter to voters. While they didn't necessarily matter as much for Donald Trump, that's not to say also that his opponent, Hillary Clinton, didn't have as many as well. And when you had Joe Biden, who had significantly less, well, guess what? He won the election, and yes, there are a lot of circumstances that went into it. What I will say is that the candidate quality here is very high up for the Democratic Party and very low for the GOP. But in the state of Colorado, I don't know if I necessarily see that. The only problem is the national environment simply isn't there. It might have been there had Republicans continued their upward trend in the generic ballot, and maybe Colorado could have become more competitive. But now it ultimately relies on whether or not Democrats are going to actually, or Republicans, sorry, are going to spend money on this race, whether they're going to actually spend money on their other races more efficiently, and what that will mean for the future for the state of Colorado and many other swing states. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.